Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Pallavi Iyer, the award-winning foreign correspondent who has reported across China, Indonesia, Europe, and Japan. She's been earlier also on our author interaction series that was last year with her book, Jakarta Tales. In fact, she's the author of several fiction and non-fiction books, including the best-selling China memoir, Smokes and Mirrors. She currently lives in Spain, and I must tell everyone that I'm a big fan of her writing. So welcome, Pallavi, on our 67th author interaction today under Trends Literature Series to talk about your new book. And I must show this book. Wonderful, beautiful cover as well. Orienting, yes, it's a selfie moment. I'll take this picture. Yes, and we're going to talk about this beautiful book, as I just mentioned, Orienting, which is a part travelogue and part reportage, and definitely written, as always, in Pallavi's most landmark humor. So Pallavi, welcome to our forum today.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be back, Neeta, and congratulations on your wonderful series on the 67th episode. I think the last time I was on, it was maybe the 20th or the 22nd, something like that. So it's really great to see it continuing and growing and going from strength to strength. So it's a pleasure to be back.
Thank you, Pallavi. In fact, Pallavi, your book, Orienting an Indian in Japan, is definitely an enchanting and engaging read. Once I started, I just could not put it down because I've been always a big fan of Japan. My husband has been to Japan at least 7-8 times, but never had the opportunity. So it was kind of a short exertion for me through your book to Japan. And as Mr. Gurcharan Das says, and I quote from the prologue, that it's definitely a highly readable book about the weft and woof of daily life in inscrutable Japan. So to start with, Pallavi, a very important question I want to ask you. It's a little bit of a complex question, but I'm sure you've been asked before. So why do you think Japan and India find it so hard to work together, despite sharing a long civilization history?
So that's something that I address several times in the book. It's almost like a thread that is running through the book. Because I think as an Indian, what strikes you about Japan is both how familiar and accessible it is, as well as how alien and different it is. It's kind of both of those contradictory things at the same time. We have, as you mentioned, the civilizational connects and the Hindu-Buddhist arc that cuts across from India through China, Korea into Japan, as a result of which there are some parts of the culture, some habits like, folding hands and a namaste gesture, some of the rituals that are associated with the temples, with the Buddhist temples in Japan, those will be familiar to an Indian and they kind of form a resonance, as an Indian. But at the same time, there's so much about Japanese culture which is completely different, not only from India, but I would say from the rest of Asia. In many ways, it's an outlier, both geographically, it's on the edge of the continent of Asia, but I also think civilizationally, it's quite a distinct and unique part of our continent. So what was the question again? I'm so sorry. I started talking and lost track.
I mean, as we have noticed that Japan and India.
Oh, yes, I get it. I remember. So you were talking about how is it that they don't connect better, right? Was that the question?
Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly. So the thing is that on paper, I think the relationship between the two makes perfect sense, right? So Japan has an aging demographic and India has this young and dynamic workforce. India needs infrastructure development. India needs investment in developing its economy. And Japan has that kind of capital to spare. We don't have any historical conflict like India and China, for example. We don't share a border. So Japan is close, but it's not that close that it becomes problematic. So when you look at the bilateral relationship in theory, it should be the perfect fit. But then when you actually drill down and start looking at, for example, what are the bilateral trade figures, it's really quite low, especially when you compare, our bilateral trade, both India's bilateral trade and Japan's bilateral trade with China, for example, which is a kind of rival country country for both of these countries. But there's no comparison. India's bilateral trade with China is multiple times more than it is with Japan, and the same goes for Japan with China. And I think one of the main reasons for why we have this problem in working together, despite this theoretical fit, is actually cultural. And when I say cultural, I'm not talking about the Buddhist civilizational. I call it the Jugaad versus Shokunin dichotomy. What do we mean by that? People in this audience will be familiar with the term of Jugaad, so I don't really need to explain it. It's this kind of flexible innovation, low cost innovation, frugal innovation. It's like the patching the tear and, you know, finding the loophole and doing the just good enough, right? Just in time and all of that. Shokunin is the antithesis of this, and it is very much, you know, part of the spirit of Japan. It is the spirit of it, which emphasizes the quest for perfection, and it is you know, found in so many different layers of Japanese culture, from the way that the sushi chef prepares the rice, to the great woodblock printers, to the great swordsman, and in modern day Japan, to how businesses are also run. I mean, there's this idea that there is a goal, and the goal might even be elusive, which is perfection. But the point is the practice and the repetitive practice that is trying to get us closer and closer and closer to that goal. And in many ways, I think this Jugaad and Shokunin parts of Indian and Japanese culture are the antithesis of each other. And it makes it very hard for the two to therefore come together in reality, in practice. And ironically, I think the one culture that actually is in the medium, is the happy medium between the two, is China, which has both that sort of flexibility and practical mindedness of Jugaad with the perfection of processes and the repetition and the desire ultimately to do a really good job rather than the just good enough, you know.
So right. And I must tell everyone that you'll find so much more what she's talked about just now, and so much more than that in the book. So all you have to do is order for the book and read, as I've done. So, you say in your book, Orienting in Japan, that before, when you were leaving for Japan for one of your assignments with your husband, that you were really, before that, you were really missing a critical piece of the Asian jigsaw puzzle. And your book definitely has been written in the most engaging and the most, I must tell you, it's really very, very accessible to anyone seeking to understand the various complexities of Japanese life. Still, I mean, while you were writing this book and while you were staying there, so what was the most surprising part of Japan that excited you and perhaps troubled you too?
That's interesting. So many things that surprised me. I suppose one of the first things that surprised me was the fact that you had children as young as 6 and 7, primary school age children walking around independently, some of the world's busiest traffic intersections, completely unsupervised, taking public transport, taking buses, taking the metro, and going across what is one of the world's biggest metropolises. You know, Greater Japan has 30 million people, and yet you have children traveling and the whole society in some ways functioning with the levels of public trust that you would really expect in a village, where everybody knows each other face to face. That is obviously not the case in a city like Japan, but that is still the kind of security and safety that is assumed and allows people to, allow their children to wander about from the time of grade 1 onwards or taking public transport. And having moved to Japan from Jakarta, I was in Indonesia for 4 years before that. And being from India myself, to me, it was almost like a fairy tale or science fiction. The idea that you could have these 6-year-olds and their parents are just letting them go on their own through the city. But this was just like a normal fact of life. What else surprised me? What surprised me was the celebrity status accorded to flowering trees. I mean, to be in Japan during the spring and particularly during the cherry blossom or sakura season, it astonished me the kind of the lines, the crowds that would gather in front of a really beautiful tree, and those kinds of lines and all I've only seen, you know, for people who want to get autographs from celebrities or sporting stars. Like in India, that kind of adulation would be reserved for Bollywood or cricket, and here in Japan you had it just for nature, for like, you know, a spectacular tree. People would wait sometimes for 3 or 4 hours just for the pleasure of being able to go and behold it with their eyes and drink in that beauty. And then there were so many other things. I mean, there was incredible art on the manhole covers in the city. If you look down, and you know, normally we just think of manholes as associated with sewage and something dirty and disgusting. And here it had been elevated to something that was really aesthetic and stunning. There was this crazy array of vending machines and the mad offerings that you find in them, from cooked meals to origami cranes and bananas and umbrellas. I mean, there's just nothing in Japan that you can't find in a vending machine. And then I suppose the last one would be, you know, the lost and found system. I mean, what was really, really impressive and that stood out to me about my time in Japan was how almost anything that you lost would be found by somebody and brought back to you. And this led me to do research, and I found astonishing facts, like something like 85% of money that is lost in a city like Tokyo is usually found and returned. So this is hard cash, and the amount of hard cash that is lost and returned, we're talking about millions of US dollars, and it's all handled through the police. And I myself lost my wallet, I think in the very first week that I was in Tokyo. And the next day it had been found and turned into the police station, and I was able to get it back. So I really think of Japan as the place where what is lost is always found, you know. I think lost and found is the superpower of the Japanese police. If that's one thing that they are really good at, it is lost and found.
And I think you got that exposure right in the beginning of your trip to Japan, and you refused to believe your husband when he said that, you know, he understood from his little bit of Japanese that he knew that they were talking about that your wallet is found.
Yeah, that was exactly. That was a very funny episode because I lost my wallet and I was very depressed because it had cash, of course, but also credit cards from several different countries. And I realized that even if I canceled my cards, then I couldn't reactivate them because I had to be in those countries to, you know, use the ATM for the first time. One. Secondly, I had just got my Japanese residence permit, which is very complicated to get. That was also in my wallet, which then now I had lost. And they had told me that even if you lose anything, don't lose that. You know, that was the one thing that was supposed to be sacrosanct. So I just felt awful. I was heartbroken. I had looked everywhere for this wallet. I had traced my steps. I'd looked on the road. I'd gone to the metro stations I'd been at, couldn't find it. And I was kind of lying on the sofa. And then a friend phoned me and said, why don't you go to the police station and file a report? And I'm thinking, why would I go to the police station? What are they going to do? Because frankly, a lot of the other countries I've lived in, the last place you go to when you're in trouble is the police station. You get into more trouble by going there. And I thought, you know, I mean, like including in developed countries in Europe, like for example, I was also robbed once in Belgium, in Brussels. And there, you know, when I went to the police, like they filled out a report for insurance, but there was no question that they would ever recover the items. They never even asked me for my address. And when I said, why don't you want my address? They said, why would we want your address? And I said, because what if you find my missing items? And they laughed and they said, we're not going to find them, right? So I was expecting this, and I went very reluctantly to that little Koban. The Koban is this kind of police chowki. They have like every 200 meters, a small little cabin type of thing with maybe 1 or 2 cops and a little desk with a phone. So I went to the closest one near my house with my husband. And as you said, he spoke a little broken Japanese. I spoke none at all. And he explained the problem. I filled in a form and they made a few calls. And at the end of it all, they spoke for a long time to my husband. And he said to me, it sounds like they found your wallet and they're saying to go to another station and get it. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, no, you know, darling, I think your Japanese is not very good and you haven't understood what they are saying. They must be saying that they will call us at some point in the future if they find it. And he was like, no, it's there already. And sure enough, we went to the big police station that was close to this little chowki, and they opened a drawer and my wallet was sitting in that drawer as it came out, which really again felt like science fiction and a fairy tale. There was a lot about daily life in Japan that would just strike me as preternatural. So different, you know.
Absolutely. So right. So and there's so many other anecdotes that a reader will find in your book, and I'm sure would love to go through it. You know, in spite of everything, I mean, in spite being a technological superpower, and in spite of the fact there's so much in, you know, order everywhere, there's so much in control of everything. But I'm sure, and you talk about it in the book, I think your 10th chapter on coronavirus. I feel that, your experience of living through the pandemic in Japan and also the insistence of Prime Minister Kobe to hold still among everything the Tokyo's Summer Olympics. You know, that really puzzles me. I mean, they could not really handle the whole epidemic and also the lockdown properly. So what do you have to say about that? What happened? Why did they really, really fell apart?
I think they've actually handled it quite well. They just took a long time to do that. Like, I think the
initial response.
Initial response. And I think that is often the problem in Japan, because Japan's is not a flexible society. It functions very well when things are going according to plan. But when something unexpected or out of the box happens, because it tends to be a very hierarchical and quite a rigid society that has set ways of doing things, it's hard to do a very quick course correction. That's when they need more jugaad. You know what I was talking to you about earlier, this kind of ability to be pragmatic, flexible, and respond very quickly. They can be extremely slow because they are very risk averse. So they don't want to take the risk of things going bad. So for example, they were amongst the last in all the countries, developed countries of the world at least, to do their vaccinations, because they took a long time to think that it was going to be okay to approve the different vaccinations. They started much slower than the rest of the world. But once they started, which was, I think, late summer this year, unlike America, which had started by like January, February this year, they started 6 months after the US, but they have now vaccinated everybody. So, you know, they are sort of slow off the starting line, but then once they kind of have the systems in place, then that kicks in and they can kind of do it on a mass scale and do it with a lot of perfection and speed, you know, the kind of speed we see with the Shinkansen, with the bullet trains, the turnaround of the bullet trains, all that, you see that, but it takes a while to get to that point. They're not able to be very flexible in their reactions. But I think what surprised me most about Japan was their digital backwardness, because like most of us, Neeta, we have an image in our mind of, you know, of Japan being on the tech edge, you know, a cutting edge of what's happening in the world. And I think, you know, especially from the 1980s, when it had so much innovation, like with the Walkman and all of those electronic gadgets and the big brands, Sony and all of that, we have that in our mind. And when I moved to Japan, I was surprised to find how difficult it was to actually get some very basic things done. Like opening a bank account, getting a mobile phone, getting an internet connection, all of which were far more efficient in China, so forget about it, but even Indonesia, you know, and how little you could actually pay by credit cards. There were many places in Japan where you had to pay cash. Cash was still king. And again, if you're thinking about China, where even the beggars now have QR codes, you know, on the road. In Japan, surprisingly, it was a very cash economy. And then during the coronavirus, that became even more apparent in both the educational system and the health system. Education, because, you know, the rest of the world went online quite seamlessly, including, you know, India, Indonesia, Thailand, all these neighboring countries, which are economically not as developed as Japan. But in Japan, the schools were not online for months and months and months. And they were sending worksheets home to the children by post, with answer sheets that parents had to correct, and then they had to mail these answer sheets back to the teachers. I mean, it was so analog, I can't tell you. It felt like you were in the 19th century, you know. And the same for the healthcare. They couldn't do telemedicine, you know, because they have not approved it as being safe. So because, like I was saying, it's part of this whole thing about being risk averse, that it would take them years of testing and all that before they kind of said, okay, we can do telemedicine to the same degree of safety and efficacy as face-to-face. And they had not got to that point. Now, the pandemic means that you have to react quickly, and maybe you can't go through all of those processes and wait for 3 years of experiments. But it becomes very hard for the Japanese to adjust to that. And then, you know, we found out things like 70% of medical records were still on paper. They had not been digitized. They were not on computers. You couldn't pay by credit card in some hospitals. So, I mean, there were so many issues like this that cropped up. Teleworking was hard because, they still used to use this seal. They have this thing called a CHOP. And instead of a signature, they use this seal, the stamp, to formalize and legalize all transactions and documents. And those seals are usually kept in the office in a sealed safe over there. And they don't accept digital signatures. So all these people, when they were not supposed to be commuting, they were not supposed to be working, they were supposed to be working from home. This whole thing arose of, but what about the CHOP? And so then you had people that were traveling and breaking the quarantine just to go to the office to take out the CHOP and chop it because, they couldn't do digital signatures and things like this. So it is a very surprisingly analog society. And like I said, I think the pandemic actually revealed this. And it's interesting because when I wrote about this for Indian newspapers, I used to get messages from people saying they didn't believe me. As simple as that. I don't think what you are saying is true. Because I think it's so instilled in us, this idea of the techno-utopia.
Yes. And their pursuit for perfection. So, I mean, and since it's a rule-based society, I'm sure these problems had to happen, and they happened during pandemic. But yes, no, I'm sure I also really refuse to believe what happened there. But and I read your book and I was convinced, yes, it did.
Neeta, Japan is very modern in the sense of being 1980s modern. It's a bit stuck in the 80s. You know how we had all those movies in the 80s that were like Back to the Future and sort of imagined what the future would look like. I think Japan is a bit like that. It's like our imagination in the 80s of what the future would look like before the digital revolution, So it's very neon. You have a lot of flashing lights. You also have these kind of robots that were very popular in the 1980s, like the SoftBank, Japan's biggest bank, has like a humanoid robot that greets you when you go in. But then when you go in, you can't actually order a credit card. You can't actually have joint bank accounts. You can't make digital payments easily. So the robot is there, but then, all the processes are actually still very backward. So it's a very interesting mix.
No, I'm sure it's, you come to know so much more when you read the book. I'll move on to the interactive because of the time that we have a little bit. We've compiled together a few interactives that we just got. So Dia, will you please take up these interactive questions? And I'll come back to my question, I'm permitting. Yes.
Hi. So first of all, I'll have to say it's so interesting listening to you and your book, specifically since I've always been intrigued in knowing more about Japan. I mean, the culture, the pop culture, the stunning architecture, the people, the food, and even the healthcare has always been something I've been fascinated by. And I'm sure anyone would be if they knew more about it. So thank you for this discussion and this book, which I will definitely be reading. So getting to the question answer round, I have compiled 3 questions that I've received from people.
Okay.
The first question is from Pradeep Nagpal. He asks if you are treated differently as a foreigner in Japan.
Yeah, that's a great question, Pradeep. And certainly there's a very strong in-group, out-group culture in Japan, where not only are you treated differently if you're a foreigner, you're often treated differently if you're a Japanese who has spent considerable time abroad. So I've even spoken to Japanese people who say their parents were diplomats or were working for an MNC and therefore studied in the US. And when they returned to Japan, they found that they were not easily accepted back. And in fact, for a long time, they used to have these special transitional schools that were specifically meant for returnees, for children who could not be expected to go directly to a Japanese school because of the bullying they would face. And so they were sent to this kind of transitionary school where they would gradually be acculturated, which essentially meant losing their foreign mannerisms, no longer, using English phrases in the middle of their Japanese, and essentially being kind of de-foreignified and brought back into the Japanese fold. So there's a very strong sense of ethnic homogeneity. It is not a very immigration open society. it's a developed country, but amongst the OECD countries, it has an abysmal rate of acceptance of asylum seekers, for example. I think every year it takes in about 20 foreigners, like 20, not 200, compared to the thousands that are taken in Europe, for example, every year. And it has now opened up a little bit to economic migrants because, they have such an aging demographic. And as a result, there's a huge need for care workers, for people, nurses, and people who are actually caring for the elderly, and the working age population is shrinking. And so there is more and more of an awareness that, frankly, what are they going to do for the future if they don't have people from outside coming in? It's interesting because in the Japanese media, this debate is usually framed as immigration or robots, because there's a strong number of people who believe we don't want immigrants, we'll just make robots who will be the care workers and so on. And part of the reason is that they feel that, a lot of what they've achieved, what I was talking about earlier, like that sense of safety and security and all of that, has been achieved because they have such a strong sense of community. And they feel that once you open that and then you kind of dilute that with people who are not part of that culture and who are not part of that history, it might change some of the things that they hold dear to their heart, like the fact that the kids can travel on their own. So it's a complicated question. I think, of course, it also depends on what kind of foreigner you are. If you are a privileged expatriate foreigner, or if you are a migrant worker that's coming to earn a blue-collar wage, because like in all parts of the world, there is also a sense of class in Japan. So, I mean, for a foreigner like I was, who was a very privileged foreigner, although I was treated differently, I think that worked in my favor because, it meant that you could enjoy all the best things about Japan, but actually not suffer from the negative parts of Japan, which a lot of Japanese people suffer from, which is having to know exactly how to behave in what situation, observe the hierarchies, observe all the social obligations, which as a foreigner you were exempt from. You could make mistakes, it was no problem. So you didn't have to spend all your time worrying about making faux pas in public. Whereas I think a lot of Japanese feel a lot of weight of social expectation on them all the time, and which limits their freedom of being able to just be themselves. Their individuality can often be quite suppressed. So of course, as a foreigner, I was not subject to that, and that's wonderful. But there is a kind of, I think, what in many parts of the world would be racism. I mean, there are spaces in Japan that will be only for Japanese. They put up signs, restaurants, spas, and they claim that the reason is that the staff is not trained to handle foreigners. But what does that mean? What is handling foreigners? To me, it's quite an unacceptable sort of mentality. Although many Japanese people seem to sort of think that this is not racism, this is actually caring for the foreigners, because we can't actually provide them with the kind of service we would like to. So we'd rather just not have them. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you, Pradeep.
That is interesting. I actually read something about that, somebody's experience about going back to Japan. And I was wondering if it's like that for the majority of them. Well, that clears things up. They have the sense of community. Just one second. Yes. So the second question is from Rajiv Batra. He asks an interesting question, that what do you think about the Japanese sense of humor? I mean, technology, fashion, food are known, but what about their humor?
Yeah, I have to say that there were many things that struck me about Japan, and I think quite a fine aesthetic sensibility would probably be the number one, but not necessarily the sense of humor, because again, I think there's too many, at least not a subtle sense of humor. There's a kind of broad sense of humor that you will see on Japanese television that comes, which is a bit, for me, unsophisticated in the sense of making fun of people, or, torturing somebody and then laughing at the fact that they are finally collapsing. A lot of these sort of reality TV competitions where, you make them do ridiculous things and then you laugh at them doing that, but not a kind of raucous sense of spontaneous humor punning or little jokes that kind of creep in everyday life. And to be honest, I found that a lot more in China, which I think surprises people often because they have an impression of the Chinese as being very, inscrutable or kind of scary almost. But I found the Chinese hilarious and funny and always willing to make a joke and then laugh loudly. In Japanese culture, it's not even very acceptable to laugh very loudly because it's kind of creating a noise and you're not supposed to show your teeth. So, often when people laugh, they'll then cover their mouth and go ho, 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 like this. So it's almost like pushing the laughter back into the body, when you look at the body language rather than letting it out.
That's certainly interesting. So the third question is from Anu Batra. She wants to know more about the research work you undertook in writing this book and also how much time did it take?
Yeah. So I lived in Japan for 4 years and I was researching for 3 years before I began writing it. And then I wrote it over a year and a bit. Maybe in a year I would have finished it, but then just as I finished it, the coronavirus was changing many things. Like, for example, the Olympic Games didn't happen in 2020 as we were expecting them. And then the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe resigned because of bad health unexpectedly. So I had an extra 3 or 4 months where I was changing and updating some of the parts. The research, I think, is a combination of reporting. I was reporting for The Hindu, and so every week I had a column for which I would find an interesting topic. I would go and I would interview somebody and I would research the topic and then write about it. And, like in all reporters' notebooks, you have a lot more information in your notebook than what actually makes it to the article, which is like 750 or 800 words. So there's always a lot of information that's left out. Combined with empirical experience, I bring my own story into this book and my own observations, my own reactions. So there's the autobiographical element to it, the memoir element to it. So it's a combination of memoir and reportage. And then the third aspect of the research would just be reading, deep reading. So you find a topic, maybe it's poetry, maybe it's looking at the art of kintsugi, or maybe it's looking at the historical connections between India and China and Buddhism and how it, the path it traced across the Himalayas. And, I would find the best books that were available on that and do deep reading. So I would say it's a combination of reportage, autobiography, and deep focused reading and research that underlie the book.
So how much time did you take to write this book?
So as I said, it was about 3 years of research and experience, and then 1 year plus a few months of writing. So 4.5 years altogether, you can say.
Okay, so we have still 3-4 minutes left. So would you like to maybe talk about something about the book that I have perhaps missed out? It's a great book, definitely.
Let me see. I mean, perhaps I can quickly read something from the end. I wanted to make a point because as an Indian, and we've had a lot of foreigners who just landed up in India and written about India. And then often we feel like, who gave them the authority to say this about our country when they know so little? And I felt very conscious of that when I was writing about Japan or when I've written about China or Indonesia or anywhere else, because of course, I will never know. I'm not an expert. I'm an outsider and giving you a partial snapshot. So I just wanted to address that criticism because I think it's important to talk about that as well. And I talk about it towards the end of the book. It's just 2 paragraphs, which I'll read out. Okay. I begin by talking about Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore visited Japan in 1916, and he gave a series of celebrated speeches in universities across Japan then. So I quote from Tagore's Spirit of Japan speech in Tokyo, which he'd given to students at Keio University in 1916. Tagore had begun by saying, quote, "My stay here has been so short that one may think I have not earned my right to speak to you about anything concerning your country. I feel sure that I shall be told that I'm idealizing certain aspects while leaving others unnoticed." How true this was of me and everyone else who has washed up somewhere and dared to write about it a few years later. Because to write a nation, to explain it, is always foolhardy. A more honest claim was one that admits to bewilderment and delight, to intuition and hunches, to vignettes and snatches of coherence, but resists assertions of authority. This book was ultimately probably as much about me as observer, my circumstances and predilections and failings, as it was about Japan. And it was best to read it as a haiku, a subjective suggestion of a mood, a tantalizing glimpse, a truth, yes, but only one of many.
Fantastic. You've really summed it well. You've summed your feelings well. And I think it's, I must show everyone the book again. You know, I can't just get over the cover. So this is
it is a beautiful cover. It has this lady wearing a sari and then surrounded by cherry blossoms and a bowl of ramen. And I love the colors, you know, they're really stunning.
I think they always do a good job. Even your last book had a beautiful cover. So thank you, Pallavi, for taking out time on a busy Sunday. I'm sure it would have been busy for you, and family time and everything. And we'd been wanting to interact on this book for a long time. And I'm so happy we could do the session today.
Me too. Thank you very much and enjoy all the weddings.
Yes. Today is a very busy wedding day. Yes. So all the best for the book, which has been published by HarperCollins, and you can always order on Amazon, and it is available in the bookshop as well. So I'm sure the readers will surely find it extremely useful and informative and funny and witty. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.